Greetings, good people. Welcome to this event, and I'm honored to be sharing real-time and virtual space with you. My name is Garrett Graddy-Lovelace. I'm a professor at American University School of International Service here in DC, Maryland, Piscataway lands, and I am truly honored to be hosting this event on sustainable agriculture through a social and racial justice lens, particularly focusing on Indigenous rights and sovereignty. We are joined by a number of wonderful panelists, but first we're going to give a shout out to our co-sponsor. This webinar is sponsored in large part by the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center. This is an extraordinary initiative on American University's campus with a brand new executive director, Dr. Sarah Clark Kaplan, as well as an interim managing director, Christine Platt, both of whom have been enormous supports and mentors for us as we further our work in racial justice at the School of International Service. Our panelists today include Denisa Livingston. She is an unapologetic food justice organizer, Slow Food International Indigenous Counselor of the Global North, and an appointed member of the Champions Network of the UN Food System Summit. Her mission is to improve and empower the lives of others, and she is committed to addressing food apartheid, which we'll be talking about a lot today, nutritional trauma, the diabetes epidemic, and the dominant culture of unhealthy foods, as well as the increasing need of healthy food access and restorative justice. Denisa has been a legislative speaker and community health advocate for the Diné Navajo Community Advocacy Alliance, which is a globally recognized successful passage of the several health laws, including the elimination of tax on healthy foods and the Healthy Diné Nation Act of 2014. She holds a Master of Public Health degree from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and is co-chair of the advisory board of the Slow Food Indigenous Peoples International Network, Indigenous Terra Madre. She's also a steering committee member of Slow Food Turtle Island Association and has just served as an advisory member of the groundbreaking initiative Reclaiming Native Truth, a project to dispel America's myths and misconceptions. She is also part of a contributor of the newly published anthology Food Sovereignty in the United States, Restoring Cultural Knowledge, Protecting Environments, and Regaining Health. We are extremely honored to be hosting virtually Denisa Livingston. We are also joined by Ms. Padmathi Koppula. Padma joins us from India, where she gives trainings in and uses participatory rural development techniques to work with villagers across the Indian nation. She engages capacity building activities and education for rural people in water resource management, farm management, diversified annual crops, and tree-based farming systems. Working with a large team, she teaches seed preservation of local and native seeds and helps establish seed banks in many villages. She does trainings for government employees in participatory irrigation management of canal systems from large community-owned water tanks from many districts in her state and beyond. In canal irrigation management services, Aranya, the organization that she co-founded, is directly involved with over 200,000 farmers in a democratic participatory research approach. She has done a lot of work with village women, helping to organize them into groups and federations, teaching them to access government resources, links to financial organizations, and she supports broader cooperatives, federations, as well as organizations working on cooperative forest management for animals, food forests for people, community herb gardens, and cooperative food preservation systems. She is also one of the leaders in permaculture across the nation of India, and she works with her husband, who is also joining us today. We're so honored, Mr. Narsana Koppula, who is one of the permaculture pioneers in India. His environmental humanitarian work has been empowering rural communities for 2.5 decades. He is a permaculture consultant, designer, and teacher, and a campaigner of permaculture practices all over the world. He's a postgraduate from Osmania University and received his permaculture certificate from the Permaculture International Institute of Australia. He's a student of Dr. Venkat, who invited Bill Mollison and Robin Francis to India to further permaculture in the region. He's a designer and professional guide of efficient water use techniques and command irrigation, and is actively engaged in implementing tree-based farming systems, planting hundreds of thousands of fruit plants and mixed forest species on thousands of tribal families' lands under tribal development program. He's one of the leaders also of the Deccan Development Society, which we'll talk about later on today, and works also on a 3-month internship with Permaculture for students across the world. So we're so honored to be joined by them from India. We're also honored to be joined by Sandra Lazarte. Sandra is a social scientist with 16 years of operational experience in international development, focusing on gender, Indigenous people, and social inclusion. Her broader expertise includes various aspects of social analysis, stakeholder engagement, and public consultation. She works in capacity building and knowledge management, particularly for frontline community groups, and is equally passionate about working with various stakeholders in the field as about ensuring rigorous and high quality documentation of social development procedures. She has degrees from Wageningen University in the Netherlands and has worked with the Food and Agricultural Organization, as well as consulted with the World Bank and other international fora. We're so honored to have Sandra Lazarte join us. And finally, we're very honored to have an SIS alum, Pamela Hess. Pamela is executive director of Arcadia and has been for 8 years. She came to Arcadia Center for Sustainable Food and Agriculture from journalism. She has a career in national security journalism and covered the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And after a brief foray into national politics as the communication director on Capitol Hill, she returned to her, quote, first love, food and sustainable farms. A decade ago, she took the helm of a local food and wine magazine that celebrated sustainable food and farming in the DMV broadly, and particularly the Capitol Food Shed. And she engaged Arcadia, where she then became the leader. She brings Arcadia a deep commitment to the mission, a large and expanding network of farmers and food advocates, and a great reputation as being one of the leaders, frankly, in sustainable ag across the DMV. So we're very honored. A round of applause for our amazing panelists. And now I'm going to go around the room and ask a few questions. Yesterday was Indigenous Peoples Day, which is a drop in the bucket of decolonization, but also an important step. I feel like we've had Columbus Day for way too many years. And so just to even have an official holiday be recognized is, a tiny step in the direction that we're moving toward. So I want to begin with you, Ms. Denisa Livingston, to reflect upon the role of agriculture and food and seeds and broader Indigenous sovereignty movements, particularly within Turtle Island, but also internationally. Thank you.
Yeah, just like to introduce myself in my language. It's Denisa Livingston and she the cheating the shan to the bashing Ose the touching the che do nanish as a touching the chanela. I see that Nasha a Taragon wool, yeah, diaquat the initiala. I just introduced myself in my precious Dene language. I am from the Red House People Clan and really excited to be here and just really acknowledging the day of yesterday. And I think every day is Indigenous Day as we are on Indigenous land. And this time of the pandemic and being in the space that we're in and the time that we are in when we're talking about the resurgence of Indigenous practices and methods and implementation of our solutions and strategies has been very critical to address the issues that we have seen, even more importantly to address the food insecurity, the nutritional trauma that we have faced through the pandemic, but the issues that have been here even before the pandemic and then being re-emphasized through the pandemic has been something that has really brought home the realities of our nations, our villages, our communities, our families, and with the spread of COVID-19, really harnessing the life ways of our people has really helped us to embrace the resilience that our ancestors have talked about for so long, but really the adaptability too. We're just learning how to adapt. We've been talking about traditional knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, but to embrace that and what we've been talking about is, seed sovereignty, data sovereignty, really looking at what sovereignty means in general, food sovereignty and all of these different things, but really focusing from the lens of equity, inclusion, and justice, but also protecting biodiversity. For us, it's really critical on Turtle Island, but also for the rest of the world and indigenous nations to recognize the collective protection, recognize the collective synergy, recognize that we have the stewardship, and that my grandma Jessie, who's almost 90 years old, still holds us accountable, to see the work forward and to see how we're doing this work, because we are holding the healing mechanisms, we are holding the healing modalities, and if we are not doing this work collectively, then we will not make the impact. And so for us, acknowledging that strength, the joy, the resilience that holds us together has really stemmed also from acknowledging the trauma, the grief, the pain that we see, in our communities, but also just worldwide, what we're in right now, global climate change, but also just seeing like the youth migration, seeing migration, seeing these big companies, big industries be the owners of the seeds and take ownership of the seeds. We've been really rallying after, the strength of our ancestors and being able to see what does health equity mean, not just health, not just equity, but relational equity, and building those relationships. And I think during this time, my last comment is that we have seen just the unity amongst tribes also occurring during this time, because there's so much diversity amongst our nations, but we've seen this resurgence, but also the first time too that our youth are joining together worldwide to stand up, in many international events, international platforms, dialogues, and conversations. And so it's a really exciting time, but also a real time of not acknowledging what we've been through and what our ancestors have been put through, but also what they survived for us to still be here. So thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you. I'm so glad this is being recorded. I'm so glad students are in the audience. This is what the youth need to hear. A quick follow-up question for you. The word food desert gets used a lot, and it has some deep problematic roots and implications. And your work is a testament to embracing a broader understanding of the power dynamics of how food deserts came to be and the discourse of food apartheid. Would you mind explaining a little bit or reflecting for the audience about the need to switch our language?
Yes, so when we first started the work on the Healthy Designation Act, which is the unhealthy food tax here on the Navajo Nation, one thing that we were all, using the word was food desert. We've seen it everywhere. I mean, even in the news, it was like over, 4 million food deserts in the US. I mean, the stats kept going up the more that we use the word. But of course, we were reminded by our elders, that a desert is an ecosystem, and not to use this word. It's full of life. It's full of even water. It's full of, life phase. It's full of food. And so we decided, we need to stop using that. And it was likewise the same concept of junk food. We were known as the junk food tax, but we recognized that when we were doing the research that junk food, there was no such scientific definition. There was junk and then there was food. So we actually got corrected in that also. And so we had to create the word in Diné, which is Iambajol, speaking to the unhealthy food, the prison food, the non-nutritious food, the food that is contaminating our bodies. But really speaking about food apartheid is that we couldn't use that. We had to use food apartheid. We had to use these words that really made sense and speaking to the nutritional trauma that we are facing. So whenever I hear that word, I'm like, no, don't use that word. And so I just want to put that out there. Thank you for asking that question.
Thank you so much. And by the way, all the people in the audience, ask questions, just populate that Q&A. That's our chance to kind of learn who's in the audience and engage. So moving now to India, Mr. Narsan and Ms. Padma Kopula, the word Aranya means forest in Sanskrit, and you write so beautifully that the forest is the mother of agriculture. This is the ancient future, this knowledge. If you could please reflect a little bit on the understanding of agroforestry as it relates to agrobiodiversity, as it relates to equity and community well-being.
Yeah, it's a great honor to be here. Yeah, it's a very, I know everybody, you're aware of what is permaculture actually. I don't want to go into more details about permaculture. It's a permanent agriculture, otherwise permanent culture. Permaculture is an environmental design philosophy, and which is rooted in indigenous and more cultural. I think that is where we define in a permaculture is very, very important aspect of not just is a design science, also it is very, very philosophical and practical. And today's permaculture is a global movement. I am one of the first person, as you said, from India, as I did my course. I did my PDC with the Bill Mollison, and my Dr. Venkat was my teacher and my mentor as well. And my Robin Francis is also my teacher. So in this context, I am very coming to the director of the food and the food systems, UN Food Systems Summit. I think in view of that, I think it's a very, very important topic to explore a lot of ideas, but this is not forum to talk much because I'm very limited. At the same time, I wanted to focus on few things. I think the global warming and climate change, these are all a lot of words which we are coming across, but still, I think the permanent agriculture is a permanent culture. I think we talk about the perennial culture. I think the food is today has become a commodity. I think food is not commodity. It is a essential to survive on this planet Earth. At the same time, you have to protect your land and people. I think that's where exactly differentiate from other school of thoughts. Permaculture is the more visionary, great visionary, and at the same time, we look for the long-term benefits, not just as a short-term. I think that's why it's a permanent, at the same time, it's a perennial. We more focus on perennial systems rather than the just annual crops. I think food does not have any meaning at all. I think food which satisfies your hunger is the food. Need not to be your wheat or your rice should not be. I think it is whatever you people to satisfy the hunger, you may grow your nuts, your tubers, your aerial bulbs and the bark and leaves and fruits and food. Lot of things are there. Not only just wheat and rice is not our food. I think this is where exactly when we talk about the food summit, I think it talk about the how many metric tons of cubic metric tons of water and the food and the how much you are eating, how much you need. I think this is calculations are misguiding us to get into the food system. I think we know more need. I think this is where exactly the regenerative agriculture and permaculture talks about. And we need more a rightful access to the resources, the people, those who are not able to get right food. I think that is having the justice, and at the same time, it is a locally available the food which is not accessed by people. I think we are trying to make access to the resources. That is where exactly we named it as Aranya is the homeland for everything. Let us observe nature. Let us observe the forest. How does it surviving, existing in this nature without anybody's help? I think can we take some of the lessons from nature? That is where we named it. We christened it as Aranya, means we have to observe and we have to try to implement some of the natural laws. I think natural systems, natural patterns, the principles which we talk about, the ethics, I think you incorporate a lot of ethics at the same time guided by a lot of principles. I think that is where exactly differentiate from other school of thoughts. Today in Aranya, we talk about most of the how we can make access to the resources. I think when I started my permaculture teaching, I think I started permaculture as permanent agriculture, but the people in India, 60% of people landless. I think where do you do this agriculture? I think agriculture is a social activity. It's not a business. Agriculture is not a business. It is a living entity. I think it is a social activity. It doesn't make it sense if you make it as a business. I think when you start your growing annual crops and some food meant for and driven by more markets, I think then the food demand will rises. And only few people, those who are affordable to buy that food, they are getting the food. I think this is where exactly the primary and basic and is a very important asset is the land. Having land, I think how to make them access to the land. That is where in India, we as Aranya, we started accessing them to resources. Before starting any planting, any growing crops, we started to look for the giving some land to the landless. I think every landless poor is right to have land. That is a slogan made us to think a lot. That is how the forests have been existing since so many millions of years, because they are very harmoniously, they are living the forest. Forest not only trees, forest includes of living and non-living and trees and animals and birds and insects, microorganisms all together. That is the sense why in our society In people are wise, the haves and have-nots. I think that is makes a lot of difference. And then we thought of seriously, we can make them access. Then we started fighting for the fight, giving the more voice to the local women. I think the women are the agriculture is good, the food is good, but done by whom? That is the issue. Agriculture is very common to talk about. I think the most of the producers, the work done by most of the women, I think you have to empower and give voice to them. They are the people, real people working with the land, and that is where the relationship started. I think that relationship should continue. That is why we started working with the landless poor, and over a period of time they became a landholders. The landholders have more right to, more voice to talk about. I think that is the reason today we are in a position to talk about the women, or I think they are the farmers. The never we call as the farmers are only always men. I think that differentiate, we always keep talking. Farmers are not men. I think farmers are women as well. I think that is where the social justice start from there. I think the food sovereignty start from there. And before food sovereignty, the seed sovereignty, which has a reproduction system that is a very close, naturally happens with the women, at the same time the seed. I think there you start your life with the reproduction systems. They are really close to the nature. Let us start with this. They are doing good job. I think why can't we encourage such people in the rural areas? That is where we made them to access to the land, started they're getting their own food. I think exactly the right way to do with the women agriculture. Definitely it is sustainable and it's a permanent. That is why in the permaculture we talk about who does the land and who has a relationship with the land. They are the owners, they are the custodians. Owners, nobody is a owner on this planet Earth. They are just custodians. I think exactly that effort we did it, we succeeded, and we made them to access the resources. Today they have a wisdom, they have a knowledge, and regaining the control over their resources. That is where exactly you have to talk about the food sovereignty and food justice. I think everybody know system which cannot exist without their effort. I think we have to make them available to this available food to the local people. I think you create, you generate, and you have to make them available to the local resources. I think you have to start locally, and you have to think locally and act locally. Not globally may come later, but we are getting into more and more people. We are able to reach out more farmers and more landless as well. I think that is where exactly the permaculture and the Aranya. Aranya means, I think we have a lot of lessons we learned from forest. That is how we are trying to implement in our area where Aranya is working.
Amazing. And thank you so much, Narsana Coppola, for that. And by the way, for the audience, we will be sending a follow-up email that has links to some of the details of the extraordinary projects that the Coppolas and the broader Aranya movement are doing. Padma, did you want to share some of your reflections on these provocative and important ideas?
Just, I want to share a few experiences, like one, Dalit women, like oppressed communities, having the land access to them. Like they used to say, like, I'm just repeating what they used to say. So before they don't have access to the land, so they used to earn the money and give the husband to get the food for them. So once they got access to the land, whatever they need, they are growing the food. So what the children and family needs, they're able to grow entire food and give in time and provide entire family. So that is like the beauty of it. The food and nutrition comes from them. Whatever the family is required, they're growing from their lands. They're keeping in their entire year as a food security for them. That gives more confidence to them. So especially in the indigenous communities, even tribal women and Dalit women, if they have a food security in their home, so that is like more than lakhs, more than money. So that's what their feeling is. And also like regenerative agriculture systems, like how the food can produce all 365 days, all seasonal crops, all seasonal fruits and vegetables. If it is accessible by them, I think that is the more nutritious. That's where we are educating as part of regenerative agriculture. So all the women, like around 20 to 25 varieties of fruits and the vegetables and then crops integrated in their farming systems in the dry lands by providing life-saving irrigations. So they able to access entire food. So, and also like even before we talk about the food, seed is very, very important. How we can preserve the local knowledge and local seeds, local preservation. So they are the real food. Actually, all the seasonals, based on their agroclimatical conditions, diversified food forest. So these are the very, very important things to access the food. We don't need to talk about the food like getting from somewhere else. So how they can grow their own food, feed themselves and supporting others, sharing among themselves. So that gives more strength and support that we could able to see during the COVID time where Aranya is working. They could share among themselves. They are not depending, they are not transport, they have not gone outside of the village. Everything is in situ within the village: milk, eggs, poultry, meat, all the vegetables, all the grains. It is they are the real self-sufficient people. So that we could see in our villages. That is a very happy thing, nutritious thing. But during these days, what is happening? More corporate companies are coming. Seeds are monocropping systems are introduced. So that's where problem. Like government is started dictating that you grow this crop, don't grow this crop. So when the policies are speaking like that, farmers they cannot do. Their policies influence is very important. So from the top to bottom, everybody should understand the situation of the environment and present situation. The same language has to spoke by everyone. Then the diversity, food security, everything will come. That's
amazing, amazing, Padma. This is like food sovereignty 101. And so powerful to see the connections to the Dine community and indigenous coalitions in Turtle Island about this question of the power of food sovereignty to anchor other forms of sovereignty, be they land and data. So powerful in health equity. So bringing these powerful stories to Sandra Lazarte. How is it you work with the Food and Agri Organization and the World Bank and the United Nations, and there's a dominant model of integrating people into buying food in grocery stores and modernizing quote unquote agriculture, and so these narratives of food sovereignty are sometimes hard to translate or convey in international fora. But how do you see these stories and powerful initiatives of food sovereignty, indigenous-led and indigenous-based food sovereignty and agroecology and sustainable ag making their way into the United Nations and other international fora?
Thank you, Garrett. Well, it's very interesting because when I was hearing Padma talk, then many things came into my head. There are many initiatives by the FAO and the World Bank trying to address this issue. For example, we have studies that have shown that women, for example, if you empower women, if you give land to the women, they translate this into income for the household and the community benefits more. That's what she was saying. There was lack of land tenure. And if you do that, if you secure the land tenure for women, there is more impact on the field. So there have been studies that have been also in terms of climate change. Women tend to practice more, tend to be willing to put in practice this climate change adaptation measures more than men. So if we empower these communities and if we empower, we have more opportunities to combat, to adapt climate change, to secure food. So what these two institutions are doing after several studies on climate change in gender, climate change, gender roles, or also food security, they are putting strategies together. So for example, FAO and World Bank at the same time, they have just developed new gender strategies for approaching these issues together with climate change. There are the strategies, and what they are doing is they are trying to promote common dialogues within a stakeholder. Let us talk, let us have a common dialogue, let us present our own models and our strategies, how to address these issues. And let us, from these common approaches, from these common dialogues, let us tailor it into national, local contexts where we can, when we can really translate these approaches into impacts. So what they are trying to promote these conversations. And another thing that also was very interesting was mentioned before, it's about on indigenous knowledge and traditional, local and traditional knowledge. When we see the issue of climate change, for example, we see that the most vulnerable people, the people that rely on natural resources, on environment to survive, are the most vulnerable to climate change. And with this comes agriculture as well. Agriculture affects climate change, and climate change affects agriculture. So the people, women, and vulnerable populations such as indigenous people are the most to suffer with climate change. So what do we do? Normally, they are the most that are excluded and not included into the development process. So when we think about their knowledge, we don't think that they do have the knowledge of conserving natural resources, using the natural resources without exploiting them. So what we are trying to do with these institutions is now, how can we foster, how can we capitalize the participation of indigenous people, how we can use this traditional knowledge. I have been working in an analysis of how the World Bank approaches indigenous people in Latin America. And we have seen that for projects, indigenous people are included in the pool of beneficiaries. It's always a very good discourse for the government to have the project approved by the World Bank. But unfortunately, we do not see indicators, we do not see activities or actions that will lead to measure the impact of the project within the communities, the indigenous communities. So we are seeing this double discourse of government, and we are seeing that this needs to be addressed. So after analyzing this, these institutions are trying to approach these issues, gender issues, social exclusion issues, social justice issues, and that it's very essential for a sustainable agriculture, right? Thank you.
So many key points. Thank you, Sandra. And most people know this, but at this point, the new data is that agriculture in its current form, largely industrial, is emitting 1/3 of the greenhouse gases, and methane, some of the most egregious. So the urgency of the climate ag interface is so dire. There's been some great questions, and Denise has already been answering them, but we'll maybe turn the mic to Pamela for a quick question, and then we'll kind of open it up. And maybe Denise, you could read aloud your great answers to those questions. But to get us going, Pamela, you are working right here in Washington, D.C., a place of high contradictions, arguably the belly of the beast, in terms of federal government, and yet also a pseudo colony, not even a state with proper representation, also Piscataway lands, a long history of colonial settler and various genocides, as well as enslavement and the broader questions of white supremacism. So, but also this extraordinary diversity of people and foodways in this region, the extraordinary immigrant communities. So how are you anchoring your work in sustainable ag within these broader questions of indigenous sovereignty and racial justice, as well as food desert, food apartheid? I'd love you to build off of Denise's.
Yeah, let me just fill in a little detail on food apartheid for those who aren't familiar with the term. Food desert is a naturally occurring phenomenon, as Denise said. Apartheid is a man-made system, and it's a system made to advantage one group, usually at the expense of another. And that's very much describes the food system that we have. I'm not sure that anyone sat down and twirled their mustache and said, let's make this so that it happens. It's sort of a natural outcropping of late stage capitalism and the conglomeration in the U.S. and I think also elsewhere of our agricultural systems and the consolidation of capital and the decisions that have been made, particularly in Washington, D.C., but are evident everywhere, is that low-income people can't support a grocery store, and therefore the grocery stores won't go there. And that's where Arcadia comes in. We grow food on a farm in Alexandria, Virginia, that is Piscataway land. It was the Dogue tribe there, and then George Washington after them. And And so we grow food there. We train military veterans to be farmers. The nation needs 700,000 new farmers to replace the farmers who are aging out of the profession. We use the farm as a campus for school children and increasingly for adults in our area. There are something like 80 nations represented within 5 miles of our farm to reconnect them to food because most of them are living in places where they can't grow their own food. And then finally, everything that we grow, we aggregate with food from other local farmers from about 100 miles. And we take it into neighborhoods that don't have grocery stores, that have high use of food stamps, and that have low car ownership. And so people are really limited in the kind of food that they can access. And we set up complete diet farmers markets 1 day a week in 10 locations. And we accept and we double food stamps so that people can afford a lot more of the food. And our food is cheaper to begin with than what you'd find at other farmers markets, but it as good or better because we're harvesting it multiple times during the week and we're buying it from the same farmers who are selling it at the fancy farmers markets in DC. I want to say something from my background. I didn't come to this world of farming with any kind of agricultural background, and I oversee the organization. And I also didn't come with a real understanding of any of these issues. When I was in Iraq and Afghanistan, the signature injury of those wars was a lower limb amputation from improvised explosive devices that tended to blow up from the ground. And I visited a lot of folks at Walter Reed who were hurt and so that were friends or were friends of friends. And so the first time I went out in Arcadia's mobile markets in 2013, I saw a lot of people missing lower limbs. And I said to one of the staff members, gosh, there's a lot of war veterans here. And they said, this isn't war, this is diabetes. In 20 years of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, there were about 2,000 amputations as a result of combat injury. In the United States, in any given year, there are 70,000 amputations from diabetes. And this is not a healthcare problem. This is a food system problem. And so that's what we're trying to affect. There's a lot of philosophy and everything behind it, but ultimately, if people are going to be able to be healthy, they have to have access to affordable food at convenient locations, and the food has to be really good. So that's what we do. It's a small teaspoon of impact on an ocean of problem. But we're constantly sort of rejiggering the model and changing it. The model of our mobile market in DC, where we have concentrated populations, doesn't work in the suburban model that surrounds our farm. And so we're working on new food access programs there to identify the different pressures and the different problems that those folks have. So I'll stop there.
Amazing. And likewise, the work of Arcadia, we will send links in the follow-up email just to make sure everyone sees the important work that's happening in our town. So Meredith Fucci writes, while I wholeheartedly agree that we must all learn from indigenous knowledge and culture and how to live in balance and respect the earth, you survive. How do we ensure knowledge does not become appropriated and mutilated into neoliberal language and action? Such a powerful question. And Denisa.
I've been answering several questions already. Thank you for that. There's so much info to share in this little time. But I think one of the things, I'm getting some feedback, I think. Is it someone's computer? And one of the things about that is as we think about the policies that need to be created, not only on the local level, but throughout Turtle Island. One of the things that we're trying to reactivate is the Native American Seeds Protection Act of 2019. It is something that started where I am here in New Mexico, really protecting the culture and the seeds, and also the way forward about how we don't, allow this to get mutilated, but also just, what the question stated, is how do we protect this space that we're in, but also what has been given to us. You see the seeds in here that I've been drying out, and also, looking at, the corn that we're growing, and looking at, many of the things that we hold near and dear to us, is really activating that act again, getting the support. I did ask some support from the senators from Farm Aid from the virtual town hall a couple weeks ago, asking for support of that as it was tabled a couple years back. But I think working towards these policies is really critical, but also looking at the narratives that are being shared right now, talking about the UN work. I served as a champion the past year, really trying to bring the dialogue, trying to get the feedback, trying to get incorporation of the elders, the youth, and their knowledge to be able to be written. So we wrote up some reports that you guys can access, and contributing towards this food system summit. The WIPALA paper that is out there, the white paper that is written by Indigenous people, but also just the latest work that we've been doing, trying to get this, message out there on a worldwide level. The recent, food system summit that happened, we withdrew as Indigenous people. There was, the political aspect of it, as, we were asking for an Indigenous Peoples Food Systems Committee that didn't come out of the pre-summit. And so we withdrew, and, we were advocating and really putting to the point of, having this be an all people's summit. And so, that, successfully was incorporated, but we're still asking for support of Indigenous Peoples Fund, as we need more of the work to be supported. We've had publications come out, like I said, the anthology that we wrote, Indigenous Food Sovereignty in the US. This is one of the very critical aspects when we're talking about, who's writing about the work that we're doing, who's speaking about the knowledge, the wisdom. This Thursday, we have our World Food Day and also Indigenous Peoples Day. I'll be, moderating recipes from Turtle Island. This is a recipe book, but many more books that have been published, recipe books that have been published. And we're having an event talking about, the importance of supporting our food systems, but also the access to foods and the lack of access. More recently, this one came out from Ashoka, Unfinished Conversations on Democracy, Race, and the Economy. And a path forward, and I'm a contributor towards this book too. But I think when we, talk about what films are out there, Gather, this one is a great one as well. How do we support these? How do we get the message out there? Many groups, across Turtle Island, across the world are doing great work. Illuminative, hashtag Illuminative as well. First Nations Development Institute has been working on food assessments, Indigenous food sovereignty. We know, like the Cultural Conservancy out of the Bay Area. There are many organizations that have been doing critical work. And I put some other links, Indigenous Terra Madre, Slow Food Turtle Island Association, our organization, Diné Community Advocacy Alliance. But it's a really important question because it's going to take collective action to be able to support this, but also to see the implementation of it. So thank you.
I'll just jump in and say, yes. Greed is a powerful thing, and capitalism is tough. And I don't think that we can, in our current system, protect against that adequately. It's just reality. It's going to happen. If there's money to be made with it, someone's going to make that money, and it's not necessarily going to be the people who invented it or own it or created it. It's unfortunate, but a fact.
There's a few questions getting to that, but so I want to hold on to that important point. Denise put forth some extraordinary books and resources, so keep populating the Q&A with some of those great resources, and we'll circulate that out. You also mentioned the UN Food System Summit, so I want to hold space to talk about how there was such an admirable attempt to so many people kind of thinking about a global summit and convergence, and yet global frustration that it didn't include the Indigenous peoples and civil society mechanism, and then a lot of people pulling out and a counter mobilization. So I definitely want to hear from the people in the room about that. But in the meantime, a quick shout out, Daniela Mochta-Witch says, this isn't so much a question, but I wanted to say hello to Narsana and Padma. I worked with them back in the summer of 2013 and can attest to all of the amazing work they do and continue to do. I learned so much from them, Daniela says, on just how impactful permaculture can be when those teaching its principles understand the ecology and cultures they are working with. So that's so nice to get that message. And Daljit, a colleague and collaborator of mine, and I have been following the largest and longest peaceful protest in recorded history, which is the Indian farmer protest, which has become frankly a revolution, really demanding not to repeal the minimum support price, to prevent corporate capture. So I don't know if you wanted to talk a little bit about how your work at Aranya intersects with the Indian farmer uprising, and then I'd like to hear from others about the kind of broader corporate capture threat and the UN Food Systems Summit work and counter mobilization. Narsana and Padma.
Yeah, it's a very interesting. I think you are all internationally, this issue has become very highlighted. I think it's very true also. I think this is a very interestingly, these farmers in India is very unorganized sector. I think this is the first time the farmers united and they're fighting against government and federal government. I think there's a challenging the government. I think they lost a lot of rights. I think they might have custodians or ownership of the land, but the law which talks about, I think, is controlling the entire their rights and the food sovereignty and seed sovereignty and the inequality of among the farmers. They're differentiating and they're trying to divide the farming community. I think that is where exactly the farmers are protesting against this more than the law. The approach towards the farmers, I think they're very unorganized. This is the first time happened organized way. They wanted to protest in a very peaceful way, but government is very, very stern in the very hard towards the farmers. They're firing. I think last time, I think the 4 farmers have been died. I think this is one of the very, very, very sad from Indian, but at the same time, they are the farmers. They are providing food for the entire country. There's 2 states which the farmers are protesting against these laws. I think that is the bowl of rice and the bowl of production and food from entire country. In this context, I think this is the not only just is a farmers issue, it is the entire nation issue, because they are trying to hand over to the multinational companies and big MNCs and corporate sector. They wanted to bring the contract farming. So today's farmer is going to become a laborer in the same land. I think that is the fate of entire the country. Looking at that as a farmer going to be a laborer in the same land, I think nobody can imagine. I think that kind of is controlling over all the markets and the entire his life and his land and seed and what has to grow in that land also they are controlling. I think that is one of the food sovereignty where we are talking about. Is the life sovereignty also important. I think they have a right to have healthy food, at the same time right to have access to the healthy food, at the same time their rights, and they are fighting for those 3 things. Not just is a only farmers issue, it's the entire country issue. I think people are realizing. I think there's the entire unfortunate things are happening, but still farmers are uniting and they are organizing. Definitely it is going to be win the game. That is sure. This protest will realized by many people how these multinational companies and these big corporate sectors are trying to control entire market and their rights and their entire life system. I think that's where exactly the Indian movement is going on.
Thank you so much. It's so powerful and inspiring. Padma, did you have another point or addition?
Now, like everybody has to realize that self-sustenance, like because of the monocropping system, like all the marketing system, controlling systems was happening. Earlier, it was not there because there is so much of diversity is there, self-sustainability is there within the village, within the farming systems. Again, that systems need to be come back to avoid these issues. So like even farming sector also, farmers also need to think about their self-sustainability. So like we need to educate the farmers in that direction. That's what I think.
Thank you. And Sandra, Pamela, Denise. Feel free to also weigh in on the many extraordinary questions in the chat box about how can this be realistically implemented, this broader transition to indigenous-led sovereignty-based agroecological systems, while we still see so much power within capitalism. Pamela, you had mentioned this a little before, but if Sandra wanted to think about that, some of the other questions.
Yeah, I can add something to that. Well, there is there is a new discourse. There is change in agriculture. We are trying to shift to a sustainable agriculture, taking into account many other stakeholders that so far were not taken into account. Institutions, organizations are developing new strategies. They are developing new ways of working, and there is a new trend. There is now we are promoting more this local knowledge, local farming, local consumption. We are speaking about adaptation to climate change. We are speaking about inclusion of vulnerable people, taking into account traditional knowledge. So there is a new trend, and we have this opportunity, this momentum that we can capitalize within the efforts that everybody is doing. And I think we should start locally. We should take into account a specific context, local, national context of any country, and we can work on how we address these issues, responding to context. There are already efforts in different countries. For example, I work in Latin America. In different countries in Latin America, there are efforts to promote participation of indigenous people, to promote gender, to promote local knowledge, to promote local farming. Even in the United States, I see with Pamela, they are doing these efforts. So I think we have this momentum where we are discussing these things, and we can all agree that we need a shift. And as we discuss this, like here now, we promote these knowledges. This is one way of approaching, one way of keep going into the impact that we want to achieve, which is a sustainable agriculture in the long run.
Right. If I can jump in here, the problem with, I can speak to American agriculture better than I can global. The American agricultural system has been completely vertically integrated over the last 70 to 80 years. So that if local agricultural products are going to be able to command any bit of a market share, there's a whole infrastructure that needs to be rebuilt. Mills and canning and freezing, all of the ways that farmers can actually take their products and turn them into something that they can sell all year round, because farmers markets are really only good during the growing season. What many in your audience may not know is that 95% of American crops are not things that you eat. Only 5% of American production is food that actually ends up on your table. The rest of it is corn for animal feed or for ethanol or for oils or corn syrup, that sort of thing. So the vast majority of American agriculture is oriented to what are called commodity crops and wheat and cotton, things that just don't appear on your plate the way that they're grown. So there's a whole lot of infrastructure that has to be rebuilt. And then to do that, I think we need a whole lot of work at the local and regional and state and national levels to rebuild the markets for those foods. The US government has a Buy American requirement. There needs to be a Buy Local requirement at military bases, at schools. There is, but it's very small. It's, they're supposed to spend 5 or 10% of their budget on locally grown foods. And those locally grown foods are almost inevitably more expensive than the stuff that comes in on the global, in the global and national market, because those markets are basically exploiting their workers and paying them literally nothing and passing along those savings to the customers and then crushing local agricultural economies. So it's a really complicated system. And, as much as we would like to have the sepia-toned Instagram sort of approach to agriculture, there's a lot more going on than what we see when we go to the farmer's market. And I'll go quiet.
I think it's just a couple of comments. We really need to redefine what food is. 75% of what we eat comes from only 12 species in the world. And we only eat from about 100 species total. And yet there are 250 to 300,000 species that we can be eating, from. And our brother here, just recognize, the biodiversity of roots and tubers and insects, and looking at fermentation and looking at all of these different practices. I mean, I've been to Northeast India, to Meghalaya, and, I've seen these different practices. We ate spiders and, all of these really good foods. But I think, really looking at redefining what we're putting in our mouths, for us as Indigenous people to really been speaking about eating seasonally, eating with the seasons, eating what we need, not just, anything that is available and out there, or even, we teach the youth not to be, like the fast food industry, fast, cheap, and easy, to let go of the crap, the CRAP, the carbonated, refined, artificial processed foods. This is a social justice movement. It is something, that we really need to see about how we address food waste. Stop buying foods that we're tossing, buy foods that, we're actually not going to toss, that we're going to eat up, and that, we're going to eat as leftovers. But also just re-emphasizing what I've been saying throughout this whole time is we have to reprogram our tongues and our palates. And that also is reprogramming our tongues and our palates and our plates, looking at how we are putting liberation first, knowing that, we have to reprogram our tongue for liberation. The journey has to be liberating. It's not just about, changing policies, but also just the reprogramming of how we taste foods, how we eat foods, and also helping our youth to know that, those taste buds are formed when we're babies. And so looking at, the Indigenous midwifery that needs, those lessons and those things that happen when we are first, introduced into this world. Our journey starts, in water. How is water defined in our life, and how do we protect that? It's a continual stewardship of how we move forward and what we're doing every single day, bringing sovereignty to our kitchen table, bringing sovereignty into our kitchens, and knowing that how we vote with our fork is really important to address all of these different issues. I think, we do have now, the platform to be able to do that. We have elders in the USDA. We have our sister Janie Hip, who is the first Indigenous person to, be on the general council of the USDA. We have our sister Deb Holland, and so, there are so many different things that are happening. It gives me the chills because we have been in this fight for so long, but, these different things are coming as opportunities, but, we see those challenges, in the solutions. And I just really appreciate how we're trying to expose what is happening, because I don't think there's enough messaging out there, or, narratives, or, coverage about what is actually happening. There's so much great work. Chef Sean Sherman opened his restaurant, in Minneapolis. I mean, there's so many different things. Our sister on the West Coast as well, she has her kitchen in the Bay Area too. And there's so many different Chef Crystal Wapapea, she opened it, and there's so many different things happening, but I just want to reserve the time for others to comment. Thank you.
Amazing.
There's one more light on the horizon, and that is the climate change and methane. Methane only has a half-life of 10 years. So if we could divert all of the food from landfills and stop producing methane immediately, within 10 years, that climate gas would be gone. And the way that we can do that, of course, is by minimizing food waste, which I know AU is just about to dive into big, but also by just taking every scrap of food that we don't eat and composting it and returning that fertility to the soil.
And also one last comment too is the contribution to the Farm Bill next year. So I think that is now, the discussion and the movement forward. Thank you.
Yes. And so important to have Janie Hip, whom we've hosted on campus before. She's a mentor and hero, as well as Deb Highland and others. So many important points. I'll say there's some great students I recognize who've asked questions, Caroline, about ecosystem. Frankly, Denisa was actually answering that, frankly, about eating locally, eating seasonally. Madeline's question about bringing this into schools. I think we're kind of thinking about in terms of teaching the youth and retraining the palate and the tongue, as Denisa was saying. So maybe we'll go around and just do a final comment from each of us before we close out. I know we only have a minute, but we'll just start with you, Sandra.
Well, thank you, Garrett. I found it very interesting because I can see from Pam the difference with my approach, and the difference because she's based on the United States. I focus on internationally. I can see the difference here. I just wanted to say there are very nice comments, and I especially found it very interesting what Padma said, that we have to think about the bottom-up approach, and we have to think in empowering these people. So thank you very much for inviting me.
Yes, Pamela.
Thanks for having me. This is really interesting and expanding for me, because I'm so focused on local and just now thinking about some of the connections to global issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. A quick shout out also to Nash and Jacqueline, other students asking great questions. Denise is on it, answering all of those. So Denisa, and thanks for the shout out to the Farm Bill. We'll be inviting all of you all back next year to think through how Indigenous sovereignty can get into the 2023 Farm Bill.
Yeah, just as an extension to the comments I've made so far, is really looking, as we're thinking about gastronomy and the food work that we do with slow food, but also just the foods here on Turtle Island, and the work around that is social gastronomy, really connecting back to ourselves. All of us come from somewhere that, we need to learn, our grandma's methods, strategies. And, if your grandma's still alive, talk to them, speak with them, grandpa, really find out the stories, that she's holding, because my grandma, it took a couple of years for her actually to open up, to share some of the knowledge and the wisdom about our food systems. And so really the healing modalities, the healing space that we need to create for them to open up, to be able to trust that space, that, what they once were beaten for, and, they put soap in their mouths, for speaking our Indigenous languages, they, cut their hair, they've been through so much trauma that, it's not going to just be overnight that we collect the wisdom that they want to transfer to us. We need to create that space. We need to be able to have and hold that space, where, my grandma Jessie is just barely opening up, and she's going to be 100 soon. And I'm not sure how many more years that it will take, but social gastronomy, really connecting back to yourself and who you are, and, and allowing those stories and narratives to penetrate your heart, to be able to do the work that we need to get done, but also just to give us the courage and the wisdom, especially as women, because we're up against so many different factors. And, even for us, I come from a matrilineal matriarchal society, but it doesn't mean that I'm supported as a woman. We've been through so much, to be able to speak, as women. And so we need to, come together and synergize and help one another to get through this time, but also learn from one another and share these experiences and lived experiences, so that we honor those lived experiences as expertise. Thank you very much, everyone. Yeah.
So much gratitude. Thank you so much. And Padma Narsana.
I think very interesting, and it's a great honor to be here with you and the School of International Services. And I'm very happy to see all women except I'm man. I think that is where I'm taking back seat. Great. I think they are the right people to be the panelists. I think I'm very happy to see all your faces and a lot of very courageous and bold statements you made. It's true, that is a very interesting topic, is a capitalism, but I didn't want to get into more in detail. But next time, if possible, I think how permaculture is looking at as a capitalism, how danger, what is the threat in future and future generations, I think we have to look at. But as far as permaculture is concerned, I think the food is abundance. If you follow the permaculture principles and ethics, I think there is no shortage of food in the world. I think if you follow the more perennial way of thinking and more permanent way of thinking, and definitely your ethical agriculture we required today. Not just is not a agriculture is not just is an industrial agriculture. It is a social. I think it's more gender equality and equity and the justice will possible through these kind of agriculture systems. That is all permaculture or regenerative or natural or organic, whatever you say. But there is ethics in it. I think that kind of cultures we wanted. There exactly we wanted. No, it's a dry land and no tillage and rain-fed and dew-fed animal integration, tree plantation, food forest, encourage local markets and education, no industrial agriculture. I think these are some of the guiding principles to us to take into a very better position in future. Thank you so much for your this kind of meeting. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Narsana is so honored. Padma, the final word is yours.
Very nice meeting you all, like especially like whatever we are thinking, Denisa is explaining about a generation knowledge gap is there. So going back and reconnecting with the older generation, that is the knowledge sharing is required. There is a one generation gap is there. How we can bring that knowledge and how we can incorporate in our food systems. That is one of the key element, like as a team, how we can work together and further. Like it's very happy to see you all and meeting and as part of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So much gratitude. Round of applause for our esteemed panelists. And hopefully this is just the beginning of collaboration and dialogue and mutual learning. Also, thanks to Kate for helping convene us. And again, to the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center for co-hosting. Thank you, audience members, and be well.